How good it is to think about the authority of our God on a day that we recognize the institution of this authority over us we call the United States government. Happy Independence Day to you. How strange it is that it happens on a Sunday. I can't even remember when this has happened. I'm sure it's happened before. I've never been able to recall it. But it is good that we can be here honoring our ultimate authority together. To do that, please take your Bibles and turn with me to the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter. We'll be in chapter 2. And as you turn there, I want to inform you of a blessed coincidence. You know that we are working our way through a series on the foundations of the faith, hitting key doctrines of the Christian faith. And I've had a certain chart that I've been working through that the elders have approved, and that was approved several months ago. And interestingly, in God's kindness, today the topic is civil government. This is not me intentionally trying to do July 4th. The red, white, and blue here is about as July 4th as I'm going to get today. But I was not intentionally trying to coordinate this with the day, but isn't it neat that it works out that way? 1 Peter chapter 2, we'll be looking at verses 13 to 17. Let me read for us. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. I want you to listen carefully. I'm going to read something that should be very familiar to you. And I want to see if you can discern what's missing. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Does it sound familiar, right? Something's off, right? You realize that this is the original Pledge of Allegiance. It was written by the socialist minister, Francis Bellamy, and it was actually adopted by the United States in August of 1892. Francis actually wrote this original pledge for universal use. He intended that any country and anywhere in the world would be able to use these lines to express allegiance to their government. And so what we know as the Pledge of Allegiance obviously would have to change some between where it was then and where it is today. Well, what was the change? Interestingly, it wasn't until 1923 that it got specific. Congress added the words, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. But I want you to understand something. What was missing, the part that Christians always fight over, under God, still wasn't there, even in 1931. It actually wasn't until 1954, under the communist threat, that Dwight D. Eisenhower moved that we would add the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. So from its very inception, People are pledging their allegiance to this particular country without any express reference to God himself. It was a move by Eisenhower. And I'm grateful for the move. And so now we say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I want to ask you a question, though. Would you still pledge allegiance to this country 100 years ago? Could you do it if it didn't expressly say under God? I mean, is it only because that those two words were added that you feel like you can be a loyal American? Some people think that. But I think the scriptures would challenge us to think differently. Can we be loyal to a nation that is not actually under God? Friends, those may be in the pledge, but they certainly aren't in the practice and fabric of the country that you and I now live in. I mean, Christians in America, those who claim ultimate allegiance to God, are increasingly isolated and denigrated. I'm reading here from the fantastic little book, Evangelism as Exiles. I think it captures the cultural moment well. He says, yes, our cultural and political social capital is vanishing before our eyes. Yes, in the span of one short week, the Supreme Court could easily rewrite our futures and remove many of our freedoms. Yes, public school curricula are being weaponized to indoctrinate children in secular dogma and new sexual ethic. It doesn't even take much imagination to envision how well-intentioned laws against discrimination, hate speech, or terrorism could one day be used to justify the imprisonment of Christians. And you pledge allegiance to that? See, this is a dilemma that Christians have been facing for a really long time. What do you do with a government that isn't as godly as you want it to be? What's our response? Well, one popular option is to revolt. Let's just rebel. Let's just go ahead and overthrow it, and let's make this thing the way that we want it to be. It's a very American way to think of things. But for 2,000 years, that wasn't a very viable option. And in fact, even if it could have been done, it wouldn't have been done. When you look through the scriptures, you would be hard-pressed to find passages that would actually encourage you to revolt against even godless government. I think another popular option, though, is retreat. Some people just say, I don't want to deal with politics. Christianity has nothing to do with the political system. We just need to circle the wagons. We need to focus on what we can actually influence. We don't need to worry about our culture. We just need to protect ourselves. And I think all of you know those inner tendencies, those tendencies to isolate, to disengage, to just kind of turn to the inside. But what really is our role, though? What is our responsibility toward the government that God himself has placed us in? Whether, by the way, you are a citizen of the United States or some other country. What is the believer's obligation to government? I would submit to you that Peter, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, would offer a third way. He doesn't advocate for retreat. He doesn't advocate for revolt. He actually advocates for what I will call realignment. Realignment. Peter, in this particular epistle, is writing to a group of Christians who have been scattered basically to the four corners of the earth. They're primarily Jews who, because of hot water political situations, had decided to put themselves in what they thought would be more comfortable context, and they found out that the Roman Empire is a big thing. It's kind of hard to escape it. So no matter what city they ended up in, most of these in what we would know today as Asia Minor or Turkey, they were experiencing some hostility, and it wasn't the active persecution that you would imagine under the later rule of Nero. At this point in the authorship of this letter, it seems that they're primarily being ostracized, humiliated, sidelined, marginalized, made fun of. Sound familiar? That's exactly where they are. And so Peter writes, and he wants to encourage them. And he encourages them most fundamentally with reminding them that, look, you're not a people of this world, you are the people of God. You are His special people, you are His peculiar people, you are His chosen nation. And that is great news, right? Like we can remember, like, hey, we belong to a better city. At the same time, we still live here. So what is the responsibility here? And it would be tempting to think that since we are the people of God, since we are in some ways as the church, a special nation unto Him, it'd be easy to think, well, let's just throw off the rules of the government and do our own thing. Let's declare war, if you will, on society. And Peter will not allow this. Look at the verse right above where we started today, verses 11 and 12. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles," notice you don't belong here, sojourners, exiles, "to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul, and keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of your visitation." So God is actually concerned that His people have a good reputation in the communities that He's placed them in. And one of the first ways that He actually wants them to impress the community around them is through submitting. Submitting to pagans. In these verses, 13 to 17, he talks about submitting to pagan rulers. In verses 18 to 25, he talks about submitting to pagan overseers or lords or masters. And then in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, he talks about submitting to pagan husbands if you're a wife. I mean, like, if he's giving a strategy, like, number one thing for him is, okay, you want to impress the culture around you, you want to make God look good, submit where you can. That's why I say the strategy is realignment. He is actually saying, get under the rule of our authoritative God by getting under, in this case, the rule of government. I know that's fraught with difficulties and what ifs. But let's not miss the point. At the end of the day, this text is incentivizing submission to the government for three reasons in particular. It's motivating us to get under our government for three particular reasons. If you're taking notes, you could write these down. The good it accomplishes, the credibility it creates, and the freedom it displays. The good it accomplishes, the credibility it creates, and the freedom it displays. Let's first note the good that it accomplishes. It is good for us to get under the government that God has placed us in. By looking at verses 13 and 14. Notice the main verb that just kind of overrides everything that's happening here. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Be subject. What's interesting is that's actually not even the active word, submit. This is in the passive. Be subject. I mean, like if you could take the word submit and make it even more submissive, you would put it in the passive. And that's exactly what he did here. He said, allow them to rule over you. The word submission is a tough one in our own day. We don't like to talk about it, but it specifically means to arrange yourself under the authority of another individual. To arrange yourself under another individual's authority. And in that time and in that world, it was most frequently used in military metaphor and terminology. For those of you who have served our country in that way, I'm grateful. But you know that it doesn't work unless people get in line. Some people are privates, some people are lieutenants, some are majors, some are generals, but all get under the one above them. It is actually saying that you need to get in line. Get in place under this government that God has placed you under. Notice in your text, it actually says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. That's a tough word, tough phrase. Because, well, the word every, not just some, the ones that you like, the ones that you voted for. Every. And then it says human. You're thinking, I have no problem submitting to God. But God is actually here telling me to submit to humans, fallen mortals with the capacity to sin. And then it says institution. That word is a little tougher. It just means creation. Every human creation. I think that Peter is wording it this way because the rulers of that day tended to deify themselves. They like to put themselves on a higher platform. And so here, he's actually reminding them that even though you're supposed to get under them, this thing that we know as government is still a human creation. It is ordained of God, but like it is constructed humanly. Sometimes it is a monarchy, sometimes it is an empire, sometimes it is a democratic republic, sometimes it is an oligarchy. Just review your history book to find out all the creative ways that humans have organized themselves. But the point is, get under that. Or whatever it may be. The emphasis is actually on the individuals. Get under these particular rulers. Notice how it continues. Whether it be, he's going to give you some examples, to the emperor as supreme. Well, that's not hard to understand. An emperor is like the guy that's in charge of everything. And notice it even says as supreme. The one that's actually calling all the shots, if you will. And not only do you get under the emperor as supreme, but it adds in verse 14, everybody that the emperor places under him. Notice, or to governors as sent by him, talking about the emperor, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. So this is really broad. When it says get under government and everyone that is under that government, we're talking something that's huge. So everybody that is under the one that is in charge, this even includes police officers and folks down at the DMV office and tax collectors and legislators and Supreme Court justices. Everyone that represents authority, you're supposed to get under, the whole span. And by the way, it says every human institution, every human authority. I mean, frankly, friends, there are authorities in other spheres of life as well. Some of you live in an HOA, and guess what? There's a rule there. If it was like my last HOA, it's not much of one. By that I mean there was actually fights and that type of thing breaking out, and the police had to come. It was a mess. But still, somebody's trying to rule that place. Point is, friends, we've got a lot of opportunity here. There's a lot of chance to obey this particular command. And if you could only jump back into the Wayback Machine, if you will, and see what was going on in that day, I think that you would be able to obey all the more wholeheartedly in the context in which you currently have opportunity to submit. Because our normal objection is, you don't know how twisted and crooked that board is in my neighborhood. Or you don't know how incompetent they are at the DMV. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you say that. Justin, do you know who's serving as President of the United States right now? Do you know who's sitting in our legislature as we speak? This is horrendous. Wake up. Be grateful. Do you know who the emperor is at this particular time? Does the name Nero ring a bell with anybody? Maybe you forgot, like, what this particular guy was like. And I can't, by the way, look it up on Wikipedia if you want. I can't even say in mixed company what this guy was actually like. He was degenerate. He was wicked. I can give you some highlights, or, lowlights. Well, one was he had a weird relationship with his mother, one that we would frown upon. Secondly, he had her killed. Thirdly, he was immensely immoral. Fourthly, he actually, as the emperor, not only got rid of one of his wives, but then married a boy. And I won't tell you what he did to him. But he was an active homosexual emperor of the entire empire. This is the one who would kill Christians. Now, at this particular time, he was losing his mind. He had not totally lost it. And so the intense persecution that most historians associate with Nero had not happened at this particular juncture, but they were already frowned upon. After all, he was supposed to be the one in charge, and they worshiped another. But all I'm trying to tell you is that Paul is aware of a political situation that is way more disgusting and revolting than you could possibly imagine, and yet he still says, be subject. Why? If we're not to be subject because the individuals themselves are so worthy or so great or so good, why then are we to be subject? The text says, be subject for the Lord's sake. For the Lord's sake. Basically, because the authority said so. That's why. It's not because they're that awesome. It's not because it's who you voted for. You subject yourselves because God has set it up in such a way that he would maintain order and rule. In fact, the text even says, notice in verse 14, that to punish, here's the purposes of government, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Like, the government is actually, even if it doesn't run the way you want it to or I want it to, it still has a net effect of promoting good and punishing evil. Sometimes we think that authority is a rather strange thing, something that is just humanly imposed and that it's a social construct that we ourselves should ignore. And yet I'm reminded of the last words of David where he speaks of the goodness of authority. And notice this, just listen out for it. This is in 2 Samuel 23. It says, verse 2, the Spirit of the Lord speaks by me, his word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass sprout from the earth. What a beautiful picture. It's showing that actually somebody being in charge is a good thing. Good things can come from that. Think of the word authority. Its root, author. Authorities should author life. You all have been under good authorities from time to time, whether it be a teacher, a parent, a coach, a boss. You've known what it's like for somebody to use their authority well. You know that it accomplishes good purposes. In fact, Paul is so clear on this. Again, under the same system of government, he says in Romans 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. Friends, I know sometimes we think that the alternative would be, well, no, let's not have an authority. If the authority doesn't run things the way that we want it to, let's just get rid of it. And I think that in the last year we've seen what ultimately happens when someone says, no, we don't need authority, we're just going to do things our own way. It was back, it's hard to believe this was a year ago. It felt like 10 years ago. June 8th, 2020. Do you remember what happened in Seattle? I think that people should be writing about this in history books for years to come. On June 8th, Seattle police frantically loaded what they could from the East Precinct into trucks and cars, and within hours they had abandoned their police station because on that particular night, left-wing protesters from Black Lives Matter and Antifa declared ownership of the 6-block neighborhood in the middle of the Pacific Northwest's largest city. They called the area the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ. No laws or rules applied here except for one. No cops allowed. And despite the media's best attempts to portray this as an amazing thing, people grilling hot dogs, doing sidewalk chalk, one journalist actually snuck in, lived there for 5 days, and lived to report it. It was horrendous. You want to know what no law looks like? Just read that particular article that I'm referring to. Some of, again, lowlights were shootings, rape, arson. It tripled the wait time on local 911 calls because one of the precincts was down. The people who were there had no say over who their new overlords were. One person reported that there were regular sounds of gunshots and screams of terror at night. Just every building and business on the ground level had been graffitied and destroyed in some way. There you go, friends. You want no government, that's where it goes. Aren't you glad? I don't care who you voted for in the last election or the one before that. Aren't you glad that somebody is exercising some rule and authority as opposed to just saying, we're just going to let it go? What Peter is arguing is saying, look, even if it's imperfect, authority is still better than anarchy. God is ruling over this world in a good way. Whether it be Nero or Trump or Biden, God is ruling his world. And what is your responsibility? Submit, get in line where you can. Obey at every possible opportunities. What does this practically look like? Friends, obey the law. Pay your taxes. I would encourage you in light of this also to pray for good outcomes. By the way, that's why we regularly pray for rulers here. I understand that the grammar of 1 Timothy is allowing the governors and authorities to be a subsection of all people, and we don't necessarily have to pray for governors every week. But we do, because we're trying to express to our church family as a whole on a regular basis that part of our allegiance to God is being in accord with the governors that God has placed over us. And I would also add, participate in the system. By the way, you don't live in an empire, you do live in a democratic republic, and you get to play a part. It is a tad frustrating to me that people with such wicked agendas are so active in the political system, and Christians just kind of sit and whine about it. You have opportunity to be involved. Now, I'm not advocating that we all go and rally up and start marching and protesting. I'm just saying, avail yourself of the normal means of participation in government that have been afforded you in this wonderful country in which we live. But obey what's there where you can. I'll talk about when to disobey later. So we as God's people need to get under the government because of the good it accomplishes. There's another reason that the text provides. We should also get under government because of the freedom it displays. When you act in accord with the governing authorities that are over you, you're displaying a special kind of freedom. Actually, that's verses 16 and 17. I am not going to do that yet. Let me hit the second reason. The credibility it creates. When you get under government, it creates a special kind of credibility. Notice how Peter describes this in verse 15. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Now, as if the call to submit to human government wasn't clear enough, Paul is going to add one of our favorite, Peter's going to add one of our favorite phrases, the will of God. I mean, everybody's always clamoring to know the will of God, right? Like, you want to know the will of God for who you marry, where you work, and when you retire. I mean, everybody's working themselves up in prayer frenzies to kind of figure out these things. And the funny thing is, the Bible doesn't speak to that, but it does speak to something even more clear. Think about this. God is even more concerned that you obey the government than He is for who you marry, where you work, or when you retire. Because He was actually explicit about this. This is the will of God. Why? Why is God so intensely interested in our submission to government? Well, the text explains. This is the will of God because by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Basically, what you need to understand, friends, is that you live in a world that will constantly malign the name of Christ. They are looking for any reason to discredit you. And so what was going on in this particular culture and time was people were trying to denigrate the Christian message, and they were threatened by it. And so they were making up all kinds of crazy stuff about Christians and about their Christ. I tried to assemble just a brief list, if you will, of some of the things that they were being charged of in that particular day. And here's just a few. It was in this particular times that the Christians were being maligned for spreading disloyalty against the government, of disrupting trade, and all manner of shocking practices, including cannibalism and incest. I've mentioned this before, but the charge of cannibalism came from what we'll do later today, participating in communion. And they're like, look, these people are secretly eating somebody's body and drinking blood. And incest was this greeting one another with a holy kiss and calling one another brothers and sisters. They just couldn't wrap their minds around that. So whatever they don't understand, they accuse. I mean, this is actually something that traces itself through the first and second centuries of the church. You'll find these things in church history, these documents called apologies. And apologies are not, I'm sorry. Apologies are defenses of the Christian faith, where people were trying to write, no, actually Christianity is good for the Roman Empire, it's not bad for it. It accomplishes good things. And friends, I think that we know what it's like, even in our own day, to be maligned and criticized on account of things that aren't necessarily true. If you just can imagine the way that certain movements in recent days have presented biblical principles as a threat to a well-ordered society, it would stun you. One can be seen in the radical expressions of the sexual revolution. It is one of the most activist groups on the planet. I may speak of this more in weeks ahead. And the other is in the more radical expressions of the racial justice movement. The radical expressions of it, in which normal Judeo-Christian values like a home in and of itself are seen as a threat to society, something that must be eliminated. Friends, this is the world in which you live. You are viewed, and I am viewed, as backward, regressive, a stumbling block to progress. I mean, this speech is out there. And by the way, not only do we get negative press, but we also peddle, if you will, a pretty radical message. I mean, people do have a hard time understanding what it is that you're communicating as good news. I love the way one writer put it. He says, when we're doing evangelism, we need to understand that we already have what he calls a really hard sell. We're trying to convince people that a Jewish carpenter was God's son, come from heaven to die for our sins. He was buried, and 3 days later he rose from the dead and now reigns over all. Not only that, we're calling them also to join us as societal outcasts. And so then he asked, must we also try to persuade them about matters of history or geopolitics? Do we really want to argue for our opinion on the environment or economics? Or could those hobby horse topics end up as barriers to Christ's gospel? Friends, you only have so much social credibility to spend. And I think what the text is reminding you is that you want to garner as much credibility as possible by obeying in ways that you can. God cares about how his people are perceived on this planet. It isn't just that we let it go to hell in a handbasket. He says, you are my people, represent me well. Look good in every way that you can. 1 Peter 2:12 is what says that. Notice it says, keep your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, so that when they speak evil against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. When God comes back to this earth, those who have made fun of us and maligned us should say, like, oh, they were right. They were right. They really were good people. Peter says in verse 15 that by doing good, you put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. It says, look, at some point, they're going to look at you and not have anything left to accuse. I love the passage in Titus chapter 3 that talks about us being gentle and courteous toward all men so that we can demonstrate the gospel to them. Good works are God's way of actually correcting the negative PR that we inherently get as Christians. And so, friends, we should be actively doing good, whether it be in our community or our business or through the political process. We should be looking for ways to undo the negative conceptions that the world will foist upon us. I think, and I say this speaking to myself as well, I think we need a little more time to actually engage with people, events, and institutions other than our little inclusivistic tribes. Look, I say this as somebody who is transitioning to homeschool this year. I understand how inward we can become, but Jesus said it well. You're salt and light. What good is salt if it doesn't come in contact with corruption? What good is light if it's sitting under a bushel? If you have normal spheres of influence that you can be involved in and demonstrate well the goodness and the glory of God, get involved in that. I live in this neighborhood back here, and I just got a letter the other day asking us to show up to some HOA meeting. And there's not really an HOA, but there kind of is. It's like a voluntary thing. And anyway, they were like begging if everybody could give $50 to the HOA to help preserve the integrity of the neighborhood. And anyway, I told Tanya, I was like, A, we need to be at that meeting, and B, we need to give $50. Why? Because we live here. This is a way that we can be involved and show that we care and have some common values with those who are around us. I'm only offering that as an example, friends, whether it be you, some of you are politically connected and influential. And by the way, I know some good and godly individuals who are engaged at levels of government, both local, state, and political. I used to go to, national. I used to go to a church in Washington, D.C. And how awesome it is that some are being salt and light in those spheres of influence. Some of you work as social workers. Some of you are involved in the adoption and foster process. These are great examples of good that anybody would look at in society and think, that's awesome. Keep it up. And the text is saying, keep doing that, because they'll be less likely to malign the message of your Lord. And so, friends, I think we should be concerned about God's PR by doing good. We should be involved in government in good ways because of the credibility that it creates. And here's the third and final reason. We need to get under government because of the freedom that it displays. The freedom it displays. Look at verse 16. This is very ironic. The text says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. This is interesting. You might want to know this. The word live and the word living are actually not there in the text, in the original Greek text. It's just provided there for clarity. So they add the word live so that you can have some kind of verb. But brief little grammar moment. There's just two prepositional phrases here, and they're actually tied to the main verb. Remember what the main verb was? Submit. The Holman Christian Standard Bible does this well. If you want the better idea, submit as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but submit as servants of God. Now you can see the irony. Submit as servants, by the way, often translated slaves. Submit as slaves. Submit as free. What in the world is he talking about? Like, why is he calling us to this kind of freedom when he says we're in some kind of slavery? Friends, we need to understand that we're all slaves to someone or something. We all have some kind of ultimate that we orient our lives around. And what the text is assuming is that at one point in our lives, we were slaves to that which was ruining us. The Bible describes it this way in 2 Peter 1:4. God has granted to us his precious and very great promises that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. You escaped corruption, it says. Titus 3:3, for we too were once foolish, disobedient, deceived, enslaved by various passions and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful, detesting one another. Notice that, enslaved by various passions and pleasures. Look, we were enslaved by sin. That's what we were talking about last week in Romans chapter 8. Romans 6, verses 6 and 7. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. You've been set free. I thought about going into the kitchen this morning when the kids were eating breakfast, and instead of saying Happy Independence Day, I wanted to just say, for irony's sake, Happy Resurrection Day. Because today is still Resurrection Day. We celebrate that every Sunday, by the way. And you know, that is the ultimate expression of freedom. I know plenty of people who can cast a ballot at a ballot box a few times every few years, but are still enslaved to the sin that dominates them. And the text here is saying, hey, you need to remember something. You are actually not enslaved to sin anymore. You are enslaved to God himself. He now owns you. He is now your ultimate. And because of that, you don't have to give allegiance to these human rulers and authorities. They can't rule over you. You need to live as free. He's not saying that these people have this authority. This is authority that has been granted to them by God. But ultimately, what you are to do is obey these authorities as someone who is living a life of allegiance to God and God alone. It's kind of one of those things where it changes on the basis of just your mindset. He's saying, all right, still submit, but don't submit in the way that you have to. Sorry, one more little insight. You remember the movie The Patriot? Yeah, some of you are shaking your head. You should have watched it. You can watch it today. A good July 4th tradition for you. I watched it again last night just to refresh like my actual appreciation for what has happened in this country. And there's this fascinating scene where one of the slaves finds out, because he's been forced into fighting for this militia. He finds out that Washington has promised that if you serve for 1 year, 12 months, you will then be granted your freedom and paid a certain amount for your labor. And so as the movie progresses, this guy's continuing to fight, and every time you ask, the guys ask him why he's fighting, he's like, I only have a few more months to go. I only have a few more months to go. And by the time it gets to the final battle against Cornwallis, he shows up, and the guys ask him, what are you doing here? And it's been his 12 months. He says, I'm here because I'm free. Friends, we show up and we do what we need to do under government because we are free. Because we have another agenda. We are actually trying to display a higher lordship. And if we are the perpetual thorn in the flesh of the society and the rulers that are over us, what does that say about our master and our God? People would want no part of it. It says, don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. You know the reason why some of us buck the laws of society? It's just because we want to rebel and we want to do things our own way. It can be as simple as the ways that some business guys figure out how to cheat on their taxes, or the ways that some of you can justify speeding on a regular basis on the interstate. It's because we want to. And at the end of the day, it says, no. You submit as free. You do this as an expression of allegiance to your Lord. And the net effect of this, friends, is absolutely stunning. If you want clarity on what this looks like, just keep reading verse 17. Peter sums up his admonition with a few imperatives. Notice it. It says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Here, you want some practical action items? You want to know what this looks like for you this week? Hey, step one, honor everyone. That means actually think highly of them, value them, and respect them. And again, not just the ones that you like, but everyone. Treat them as valuable. Show them due honor. It was interesting to me that I overheard just from Christianity Today, a senator, U.S. senator from Oklahoma, James Lankford. He's a believer. He was a Christian camp counselor for a long time, like he was running this camp, and then he actually became a senator in our highest legislature. And this is what he says. He was referring to the words of 1 Peter, and he linked the testimony of our lives with honoring authority, even the godless authority of the Roman emperor. And he suggested, if Peter could call his readers to honor Caesar, do we really think that we can get away with dishonoring our own authorities? And in that podcast, he's talking about like how in Washington in particular, it's just such a disrespectful culture. Everybody is so politically charged. And he's saying that there's great opportunity for us to honor all those, especially, and I'm going to borrow another term here, our politically repugnant other. Honor everyone, even the people whose policies you so detest. Can I just give a practical word? Probably the easiest place to transgress this particular command is on social media, because you can't see the face of the individual, and so it's easy to feel a little more free. Friends, you know that the reputation of Jesus is on the line even in what you post. There are respectful and disrespectful ways of engaging with those who would disagree. And you know what the text says? Honor everyone. Treat them highly. It's kind of like when you were kind of old enough, when you finally got to the point, if you had a good relationship with your parents, when you were old enough to disagree with them. Say, oh, Dad, I see what you're saying. But, you know, I'm thinking about things from this perspective as well. Like, you're really careful, right? Or if you actually care for your boss and you're not just like, you know, some type of revolutionary in the workplace, but like you're somebody that generally appreciates and respects your boss, and you're going to say some disagreement, you're careful about what you say. That's honor. It says honor everyone. And notice this, there's special allegiance afforded to those who are in the body of Christ. It says love the brotherhood. Though we honor everyone, there is a special affection for the people of God. John 13 makes this very clear. It says that the new commandment that has been given to us is to love one another. And that isn't just loving all people. It is a special love that we should have for other Christians. So it says, as you're honoring government, don't forget your obligations to basically the church family, the other brothers and sisters in Christ. And then there's an interesting command here that says, fear God. Fear is an amazing word. It means what you think it means. But we certainly try to tone it down so it doesn't have any negative perception by talking about reverential awe and respect. We fear God as the ultimate. You don't fear the emperor. Jesus said that. Don't fear them who can destroy the body, but fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell forever. You fear God. God is the ultimate. So even as you're obeying government, government is still not the ultimate. God is still the ultimate authority, as we've been singing and celebrating all day today. And then the last one, he uses a different word again. The same one that he used, by the way, for general humanity. He says, honor the emperor. They deserve some special respect and allegiance. as servants of God. Afford them that. I would say, accommodate where you can, obey where you can. That's why I like how we can remember that even though we're free, we're ultimately slaves of God, and that's what helps us determine when to disobey. Some of you are waiting on that. Tell me when I can disobey. Tell me when I can, stick it to the government. Listen, I know that there are examples that are actually in the Bible where people took a stand against the government because it directly defied what it meant to serve God. I think of Daniel praying. I think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bowing the knee to Nebuchadnezzar. I think also of Peter and the apostles continuing to preach the gospel when they were expressly told not to. I know that those examples are out there and they abound, but don't let them obscure the point. Resistance, revolt is not your first option, it is your last. We should try to accommodate and obey in every way that we can. And once we've exhausted that option, we can explore others. But when we do this, though, it has a powerful impact. I came across this story from a pastoral acquaintance of mine. And this happened back in the mid-90s. I don't know that it would happen today, but it's a beautiful picture. Particularly happened in China, of all places. And this is according to Open Door Ministry. At this particular juncture, Chinese government officials became so fed up with sky-high rates of crime and drug addiction and sickness in this one particular county in the Yunnan province that they decided to do some research. This was like a crisis for the government. And so, believe it or not, when searching out all their options, they tried to figure out, what's the difference between some of these villages that are rife with opium addiction and because of that are poverty-stricken and overrun with crime because everybody's kind of get this money for drugs, and some of these other little cities and villages that are doing well. And they're actually productive, and there's plenty of pigs and grain, and just societally, there were these contrasts. And they noticed that in those particular cities where things were going well, there was actually a high population of Christians. Again, mid-90s, not happening today. We're backing up a little bit, when China was actually more open to American influence. So, because of their just absolute exasperation, they experimented by saying, let's see if we can actually pay these Christians to go and live in some of these most troublesome villages. And the Chinese government literally paid to move these people into the villages. And as they began to trace the results, it was stunning. The opium addictions fell. Crime fell. The society and this toxic network that had been there was starting to be flush. Within the course of a year, there were 17 new Christians in this particular village, and these 17 individual Christians soon became established financially because they stopped spending money on drugs. And then 8 of the 17 soon saved enough money to purchase sewing machines and start small businesses. And by early 2002, 83 of the villagers had become Christians, and their village was changing. And the government official said, and I'm quoting from the article here, "We have begun extending this strategy to many other villages since then." Now, I realize I'm arguing from the basis of one particular example, but I think it is a beautiful picture of the way that things should be. A government should look at a place with a high concentration of followers of Christ and think, man, things run really well there. These people are great. And you know what that does? That opens up platform for why it's great. Hey, we submit ourselves to you because we are part of a movement that honors someone higher than you. And the way it works is good works lead to gospel conversations, which lead to more good works, which lead to more gospel conversations. And this is how we have impact on the world around us. This is how the PR campaign, established by God Himself, propagates itself throughout the entire world. It isn't just through spoken word. It is the word preached on the platform of good works accomplished. And so, we get under government. Why? Because of the good that it accomplishes, because of the credibility it secures, and because of the freedom it displays. Friends, this could be us. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not calling on any talk shows anytime soon to just tell you what's going to happen in the next 4 I don't have a clue. But I do know what will happen. If we continue to obey where we can and proclaim Jesus faithfully, it would be the kind of things that we heard about in the Yunnan province. This is what God has in mind for us. This isn't something incidental. This is fundamental. Christians are supposed to be those who get in line under God by getting in line where they can under government. I'd ask you 2 questions as we bring this to a close. 1, are you even under God? Forget under government. I'm actually not concerned today if you are paying your taxes and following traffic laws and doing all the good societal things that you should be doing if you're not under the authority of God Himself. Friends, when we rebelled against God and we said, no, we'll do things our own way, that's actually why this world is in the mess that it's in. And your life is just a microcosm of the greater world struggle. If you want to know what it looks like to actually respond in faith to God's authority, I would encourage you to consider first the damage that your sin and rebellion has done. It has actually made you God's enemy. And because of that, there is not only a curse upon your life, but there is a curse upon your eternity. And that curse can only be absolved by the work that Jesus Christ Himself has accomplished. Your way back to God and His government, if you will, is through Jesus and Jesus alone. He died to satisfy the penalty. He lived to obey in all the ways that you couldn't. He rose again so that you could have life. And if you would turn from your sin and trust in Him, you would be under God, His blessed rule. And by the way, it gets way better than anything we'd ever see in the Yunnan province or even in the United States of America. One day, Jesus Christ Himself will come back and rule and reign and make this world the way that it should be. And you'd be part of that. Are you under God in Christ? If you don't know what that means, if you have questions about that, I would encourage you to talk to me or talk to one of the pastors or I don't know, use that Connect card we were talking about and just say, I have questions, and we will reach out to you this week. That is so important. Get under God. And if you are under God, it's just a simple encouragement, friends. Get under government. What a weird thing to say from a pulpit, it seems. But Romans 13, 1 Peter 2 just make it so clear. There may be opportunities that you're missing. There may be things that you actually need to repent of. And if there is any way that we could serve you or pray with you in that, I would encourage you to speak to us before you go. But ultimately, friends, we're under government because we're under God. And so I think the best way for us to conclude this service is not to express our allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. But why don't we refresh our allegiance to God in the way that He Himself has established that? And that is through practicing the Lord's table.